Get off my land." Jack Wheeler said it flat. No anger, no apology. Just the kind of voice that meant exactly what it said. Sarah Evans didn't move. Her shoes were splitting at the soles, her dress was 3 days past decent, and the boy she was carrying on her back hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. She looked Jack Wheeler dead in the eye and said, "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work. There's a difference." Jack stared at her for a long moment. Something shifted behind his eyes. "You got 5 minutes," he said. "Start talking. If this story already has your heart subscribed to our channel right now, hit that notification bell and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. Sarah Evans had not planned to beg. That was the one thing she had promised herself during the 3-day ride from Abilene. She would work, she would earn, she would find a way forward, but she would not beg. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 11 days, and in those 11 days, she had learned exactly how much his name had shielded her from the world. Without it, she was nothing. A woman with an empty purse, a borrowed horse that died on the 2nd day, and a baby girl named Clara, who was 8 months old and too young to understand that her mother was terrified. Sarah had walked the last 14 miles carrying Clara on her back, and her dignity in front of her like a shield. The Wheeler Ranch was the 3rd place she had tried. The first, a boarding house in Caldwell, turned her away the moment the woman behind the counter saw she had no money and no husband. The second, a farm east of the county line, offered her a room, but made clear what they expected in return. Sarah had walked away from that one without saying a word. She had nothing left but her self-respect, and she was not willing to trade it. So when she came up the dirt road and saw the Wheeler property, the main house with its weathered boards, the barn beyond it, the smell of horses and dry grass, she felt something in her chest that she hadn't felt in 11 days. Something that resembled hope. And she hated herself a little for it, because hope had been wrong before. She had barely reached the porch steps when the door opened and Jack Wheeler came out. He was taller than she expected. Broad through the shoulders with the kind of hands that told you a man did his own work. He looked at her the way most men looked at a stray dog, not mean, not kind, just weighing whether it was going to be a problem. "Get off my land," he said. Sarah didn't move. She heard Clara stir against her back, making the small fussing sound she made when she was about to cry, and Sarah shifted her weight slightly just enough to quiet her, and kept her eyes on Jack Wheeler. "I'm not asking for charity," she said. "I'm asking for work. There's a difference." Jack's jaw tightened. He looked past her, scanning the road behind her, as if checking whether she'd brought trouble with her. "I've got no use for a woman with a baby," he said. "I've got enough on my hands." "What do you have on your hands?" He blinked. That wasn't the response he expected. "2 boys," he said after a moment. 8 and 5. No mother. Ranch to run. No time. Sarah nodded, slow and deliberate. "So you've got 2 children with no one to look after them while you work a house that needs keeping and no help." She paused. "And you're telling me you have no use for me?" Jack looked at her for a long second. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did, a small flicker of something she couldn't quite name. "You got 5 minutes," he said. "Start talking." Her name was Sarah Evans. She was 29 years old. Her husband Thomas had been a merchant, not a rich one, and when he died of fever, there was nothing left. The creditors came fast, and the house and the stock and nearly everything in it went to settle what Thomas owed. Sarah had known Thomas was in debt, but she hadn't known how deep. She found out the morning after the funeral when a man knocked on the door with papers in his hand and a face that said he wasn't there to comfort her. She told Jack all of this standing on his porch. She didn't soften it or make it pretty. She figured the truth was the only thing she had that was worth anything, and she wasn't going to waste it. Jack listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You can cook?" he asked. "Yes." "Clean?" "Yes." "You know anything about livestock?" Sarah hesitated just a half second. I know enough to not be useless. Jack almost smiled. She could see it the way the corner of his mouth moved before he stopped it. The boys are inside, he said. Come in and meet them. If they take to you, we'll talk terms. Ben Wheeler was 8 years old and already trying to be 40. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of him, working through numbers in pencil, his brow furrowed in a way that reminded Sarah of a judge. He looked up when she walked in, looked her over carefully, and then looked at his father. Who's she? He asked. Not rude, just direct. Mrs. Evans, Jack said. She's looking for work. What kind of work? The kind that needs doing around here. Ben turned back to Sarah. His eyes were Jack's eyes, the same watchful quality, the same deliberate way of taking things in before passing judgment. Our last housekeeper quit, Ben said. She said our father was too difficult. Ben, Jack said, a warning in his voice. It's true, Ben said, completely unbothered. Sarah crouched down so she was closer to eye level with him. What do you think made her say that? Ben considered this seriously. He doesn't talk much, he said. And when he does talk, he doesn't say what he means. Mrs. Patterson said it was like living with a wall. Ben, enough. You asked me to be honest with people. Ben looked at his father. You did. You said dishonesty was a weakness. Jack Wheeler had nothing to say to that, and Sarah could tell from the way he pressed his mouth into a line that this was not a new situation. Where's your brother? Jack asked, changing course. Barn. He found a cat. Jack sighed the sigh of a man who had been sighing that particular sigh for years. Eli Wheeler was 5 years old and had the look of a child who had been running hard his whole life. He was crouched in the barn with a gray cat in his arms, talking to it the way people talk to things they love, low and serious like the conversation mattered. He looked up when Sarah appeared in the doorway, and his face did something unexpected. It opened completely and without caution, the way children's faces open when they haven't yet learned to protect themselves. Do you like cats? He asked. Very much, Sarah said. This one doesn't have a name yet. Ben says I have to call it something sensible, but I don't know what sensible means. It means practical, Sarah said. Something that fits. Eli turned the cat over in his arms, studying it. She's gray, he said. Could I call her Gray? You could, Sarah said. Or you could call her something that means gray, and that way it's sensible and interesting at the same time. Eli's eyes went wide. Like what? Ash, Sarah said. Gray like ash. It's a real word and it fits. Eli looked at the cat for a long moment, then looked back at Sarah with the absolute solemnity of a child who has made a decision that matters. Ash, he said. He turned to his father, who was standing just behind Sarah. Papa, her name is Ash. Jack looked at his son, then at Sarah, and said nothing. But he stepped back and let her through, and she understood that this was as close to welcome as he knew how to give. The terms were simple. Sarah would cook clean and keep the house. She would look after Eli during the day, while Jack and Ben worked the ranch. In exchange, she would have a room, the small one off the kitchen, that had been storage meals, and $3 a week. It wasn't much. She had no leverage to ask for more. There's one condition, Jack said when they were back in the kitchen and the boys were out of earshot. What condition? Sarah asked. You don't make it complicated, he said. I'm not looking for anything beyond what we just agreed to. You work, I pay. That's the whole of it. Sarah looked at him steadily. I didn't ask for anything beyond that. No, he said, but women sometimes. He stopped himself. Finish that sentence, Sarah said quietly. He looked at her for a moment. Women sometimes come into a situation like this with expectations that weren't part of the agreement. I want to be clear that this isn't that kind of arrangement. Sarah picked Clara up from the chair, where she'd set her down, and settled her against her hip. Mr. Wheeler, she said, I just buried my husband 2 weeks ago. My daughter is 8 months old. I have 11 cents in my pocket and the clothes I'm wearing. I assure you that what I'm looking for is work and a safe place to sleep. Nothing more. Something passed across his face. something she called shame if he seemed like a man who was capable of it. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. The first night after the boys were in bed, and Jack had gone to check the horses, Sarah sat in the small room off the kitchen and held Clara in the dark and cried. Not loud, she hadn't cried loud since the day Thomas died, because loud crying was a luxury that took energy she couldn't afford. But she let herself have this 5 minutes in the dark, her daughter's warm weight against her chest, grief moving through her like a slow river. Then she dried her face, laid Clara down on the mattress beside her, and told herself the same thing she'd been telling herself for 2 weeks. One day at a time. Just one. By the end of the first week, she had a sense of the household's shape. Jack Wheeler was up before dawn every morning. He came in for coffee, drank it standing at the counter, never sitting. She noticed as if sitting meant he was staying somewhere he didn't plan to stay, and was back outside before Ben and Eli were awake. He came in for meals, ate quickly, said the minimum required, and was back to work. He was not unkind. He was not warm. He was like a man who had drawn a very careful map of exactly how close other people were allowed to get and enforced the borders without drama. Ben was quiet and watchful, and too old for his age. He helped his father without being asked, absorbed information like water into dry ground, and had a habit of watching Sarah the way scientists watch experiments with careful attention and no fixed conclusion. Eli was none of those things. Eli talked constantly. He followed Sarah around the kitchen asking questions about everything: why bread rose, what made salt different from sugar, whether Clara could understand words yet or just sounds. He climbed into chairs and perched on counters and got underfoot in the most cheerful way imaginable, and Sarah found herself laughing at things he said before she'd even realized she was going to laugh. It was the laughing that unsettled her. She hadn't expected to laugh. 8 days in, she found Ben sitting on the back steps at dusk, staring at nothing. She pushed open the door and almost stepped on him, caught herself, and sat down beside him instead of going back inside. He didn't say anything. She didn't either for a moment. "Bad day?" she asked. "No," he said. Then after a pause, "I was thinking about my mother." Sarah waited. "Do you think about your husband?" Ben asked. "Every day," she said. "Does it get easier?" She looked at the side of his face, that serious, careful face, and gave him the only answer she had. "Different," she said. "It gets different. The weight of it changes. But it doesn't go away, and I don't think you'd want it to, really. Going away would mean forgetting. And you don't want to forget." Ben was quiet for a long moment. "Papa doesn't talk about her," he said. "He says it's because it doesn't help, but I think it's because it hurts." "Those two things can both be true," Sarah said. Ben looked at her, really looked at her the way he very rarely looked at anyone, without the guard up. "Mrs. Evans," he said, "are you going to leave like the others did?" Sarah felt the question land in her chest like a stone. "I don't plan on it," she said. "That's not the same as no," Ben said. "No," she admitted. "It's not. But it's the honest answer, and I think you'd rather have that than a promise I can't keep." Ben nodded slowly, as if this satisfied something. He stood up, brushed off his trousers, and went inside. At the door, he paused. "I'm glad you named the cat with Eli," he said without turning around. "He was upset about it for a week before you came." Then he was gone. The trouble started on a Tuesday. A man named Harlan Cole rode up to the ranch in the late morning while Jack was out mending fence at the north line. Sarah was in the kitchen when she heard the horse, and something about the rhythm of that arrival, too slow, too deliberate, made her pause what she was doing. She went to the door. Harlan Cole was a man who wore his money in the way some people wear a weapon, visibly, and with the implication that it could hurt you. He was maybe 50, with a wide, flat face and eyes the color of shallow water. He was smiling, but the smile started at his mouth and stopped well short of anything else. "Morning," he said from atop his horse. "Wheeler around?" "He's working," Sarah said. "Can I help you?" Cole looked at her with the kind of looking that was not really looking at a person, but at a thing that might be useful. "You his wife?" he asked. "I work here," she said. He didn't dismount. "Tell him Harlan Cole came by. Tell him the offer he turned down last month, it's still on the table, but not for much longer." "What offer?" Sarah asked. Cole's smile shifted slightly. "He'll know," he said. He turned the horse and rode back down the road the way he came, unhurried like a man who had nowhere urgent to be because everywhere was already his. Sarah stood in the doorway watching him go, and a cold certainty settled into the base of her spine. That man was not here to negotiate. He was here to remind someone of something. And whatever he was reminding Jack Wheeler of it was the kind of thing that could take the ranch. She didn't bring it up at dinner. The boys were at the table, and she had learned fast that Jack Wheeler kept his trouble away from his sons with the same determination he kept everything else away, tight controlled, managed alone. But after Eli was in bed and Ben had taken his book to his room, she came into the main room where Jack was sitting with a ledger open on the table, and she set a cup of coffee beside him without asking. He looked up. "Harlan Cole came by this morning," she said. The change in Jack Wheeler's face was subtle, but she was watching for it. A tightening around the eyes, a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. "What did he say?" Jack asked. "That the offer you turned down last month is still on the table, but not for much longer." She looked at him directly. "He rides onto a man's property while that man is away and delivers messages to the hired help. That's not a business offer. That's pressure." Jack was quiet for a long moment. "It's nothing you need to worry about," he said. "Maybe not," Sarah said. "But you should know what kind of man comes to your door when you're not here, especially with 2 boys in the house." Jack looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not much, but enough. "He won't bother you," he said. "I'm not worried about myself," Sarah said. "I'm telling you because it seemed like something you'd want to know." She left him there with his ledger and his coffee and went back to the kitchen. Behind her, she heard him close the ledger. She heard him sit still. And she heard faintly through the wall a single long breath, the kind a man releases when he's been holding it for a very long time. That night, lying in the dark with Clara warm beside her, Sarah thought about Thomas again, about the debt she hadn't known about the creditors at the door, about how fast a life could change shape when the person holding it together was suddenly gone. She thought about Ben on the steps, asking if she was going to leave. She thought about Eli and the cat named Ash. She thought about Jack Wheeler sitting at a table with a ledger that probably told a story he didn't want to tell anyone, and she thought despite herself, despite everything, that she was exactly where she needed to be. Not because it was safe. It wasn't safe. Not because it was easy. It wasn't easy. But because something in this house was broken in the same places she was broken, and she knew how to work in broken places. She had learned. She pulled Clara closer and closed her eyes. Outside, the Texas wind moved across the plains, and the Wheeler ranch held still against it. The next morning, Jack Wheeler was already gone before the coffee finished brewing, which meant he had left before first light, which meant he had not slept. Sarah knew the signs by now: the chair pushed too far from the table, the door not fully latched, the way the silence in the house had a different quality when he hadn't been in it long enough to fill it. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the ledger he had left on the table closed, but not put away, and understood that whatever Harlan Cole's visit had stirred up Jack had spent the night sitting with it. She left the ledger where it was. She made breakfast, got Eli fed and washed, sent Ben out to find his father, and started on the week's bread. And she told herself firmly and deliberately that Jack Wheeler's business was Jack Wheeler's business, and she had no standing to push further than she already had. She almost believed it. Eli believed nothing of the sort. He appeared at her elbow while she was working the dough, ash draped over his shoulder like a gray scarf, and said without preamble, "Papa was up all night." "I know," Sarah said. "He does that when something's wrong," Eli said. "He thinks we don't notice, but Ben and I notice. We just don't say anything, because it makes him close up worse." Sarah looked down at him. 5 years old, she thought, and already fluent in the language of a guarded man. "You're very observant." "Ben taught me," Eli said, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "He said that with Papa, you have to watch what he does, not what he says. He said Papa talks with his hands and his feet more than his mouth." "Ben's a smart boy," Sarah said. "He's the smartest person I know," Eli said completely without jealousy. "But he doesn't know everything. He didn't know what to call Ash." He paused. "You're the second smartest." Sarah laughed one of those laughs that came before she'd decided to laugh, the kind that surprised her. Eli looked pleased with himself and went back to his cat. Jack came in for the midday meal looking like a man who had made a decision and wasn't happy about it. He sat down, ate, said nothing, and was almost back out the door when Sarah spoke. "Whatever Cole wants," she said. "It's the water rights, isn't it?" Jack stopped. He turned slowly and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not anger, not surprise exactly, but something closer to the look of a man who has just realized he underestimated something. "What makes you say that?" he asked. "Because that's what they always want," Sarah said. "My husband had a cousin who lost his farm in Kansas. Same pattern. A man who dresses like money comes around making offers. When the offers get turned down, the pressure starts. And the pressure always traces back to the one thing that makes the land worth having." She looked at him steadily. "Out here, that's water." Jack was quiet for a long moment. "You're not wrong," he said. "How long has he been coming around? 4 months. And the pressure, what form does it take?" Jack's jaw tightened. He was not a man who talked about his problems. She could see him weighing it, the discomfort of saying it out loud against the exhaustion of carrying it alone. 3 of my fence lines cut last month," he said. 2 head of cattle missing. The bank where I carry my loan changed hands in February. New owners giving me until September to restructure, or he calls the note. Sarah sat down slowly, because that was a great deal to absorb standing up. "The bank changing hands right as Cole is pressuring you," she said. "That's not a coincidence." "No," Jack said. "It's not. So he's coming at you from 2 directions at once. The land through attrition and the money through the bank. That's the size of it." Sarah looked at her hands on the table. "Does anyone else know?" "My ranch hand Decker. Ben partly he's figured out more than I've told him. No one else." "You need a lawyer," Sarah said. "I know what I need," Jack said with an edge that was not quite anger but close to it. "What I don't have is the $80 it costs to get one out here." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Eli was singing something tuneless to his cat. "I'm sorry," Jack said after a moment, and she could tell it cost him something. I shouldn't have said it that way." "You're scared," Sarah said without judgment. "People aren't always graceful when they're scared." He looked at her. Something moved in his face, something complicated and unguarded, that was gone almost before it was there. "I haven't been scared in a long time," he said. "I'd forgotten what it felt like." "It feels like anger," Sarah said. "Usually." He said nothing, but he didn't leave. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he needed to, and then he went back out, and Sarah sat at the table for a while after listening to Eli sing. The thing about a household with secrets in it, Sarah had learned, was that the secrets changed the shape of everything. The weight of what Jack had told her sat in the house all that week, invisible, but present in the way Ben watched his father across the dinner table, in the way Jack checked the fence lines twice a day, now, instead of once, in the way Eli, who sensed trouble the way animals sense weather, became slightly clingier, appearing at Sarah's side, more than usual, not asking for anything, just there. She didn't bring it up again. She did what she could do, which was keep the house running, keep the boys steady, and look for things to help with in the places Jack couldn't ask for help. She found them. The household accounts were a mess. Not dishonest. Jack Wheeler was many things, but dishonest wasn't one of them, just disorganized in the way of a man who was very good at the physical work of ranching, and not much practiced in the paperwork of it. She asked him one evening if she could look them over. He said flatly that she didn't need to. She said she understood bookkeeping from her years helping Thomas with his accounts, and that she wasn't asking to interfere, just to see if there was anything he'd missed that might give him more room than he thought he had. He looked at her for a long moment. "Fine," he said. She found two things within an hour: a supplier overpayment from 8 months back, $42 that had never been refunded, and that the supplier's invoice suggested they were still holding as credit, and a grazing agreement from 3 years prior that Jack had signed with a neighboring rancher, which included a clause entitling him to shared water access that might complicate Cole's claim considerably. She set both documents on the table and waited for Jack to come back in from the evening check. He stood over the table reading, and she watched his face go through something: the tightening, the processing, the thing at the end that was not quite relief but was in the same family. "The grazing agreement," he said. "Shared water access." He looked up at her. "That changes things." "It might," she said, "if you have a lawyer who knows what to do with it." "The $42 from Carver Supply," he said. "That's real. That's real." He sat down, which he almost never did at that hour. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at the papers for a long moment. "Sarah," he said. And it was the first time since she'd arrived, that he had used her given name. Not Mrs. Evans. Sarah. She felt it land differently than she expected. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He looked at her, and she made herself hold the look steadily, because she was not going to flinch from it, and she was not going to make it into something it didn't need to be yet. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in a way that was larger than the words. What she didn't expect, what she had no preparation for, was Eli getting sick. It started on a Thursday, what seemed like a mild fever, the kind children ran off in a day. By Friday morning it was higher, and by Friday evening Eli was burning up and shaking his small body, radiating heat like a stone left in the sun, his breathing shallow and fast. Sarah had dealt with sick children before. She knew the difference between a fever that ran its course and a fever that was going somewhere dangerous. This one was going somewhere dangerous. She sent Ben on the fastest horse to fetch the doctor from town, and she sat with Eli through the night. Jack sat on the other side of the bed. He hadn't said much since she'd told him how high the fever was. He'd gone very still, the kind of still that wasn't calm, but was controlled fear, the kind of control a man exercises when he cannot afford to come apart because there is no one else. She recognized it. She had done it herself. Eli woke at some point in the deep of the night, confused and small, and not entirely sure where he was. He reached out and Sarah took his hand and he gripped it hard. "Mrs. Evans," he said, his voice raspy and young. "I'm here," she said. "I don't feel good." "I know, sweetheart. The doctor's coming." He turned his head and found his father's face in the dim light. "Papa?" "Right here, son," Jack said, and his voice was different, stripped of everything it usually carried, everything careful and measured. Just the voice of a man who loved his child and was afraid. "Am I going to be okay?" Eli asked. Jack looked at his son for a moment, and Sarah saw the effort it took. The enormous quiet effort of a man choosing to be steady for someone smaller than himself. "You're going to be fine," Jack said. "You're the toughest wheeler I know." "Ben's tougher," Eli said. "Don't tell him I said that," Jack said. Eli almost smiled. He closed his eyes, still holding Sarah's hand. She did not let go. The doctor came at 4 in the morning, examined Eli, and told them it was a lung fever, serious, but not the worst he'd seen. He left medicine and instructions, and told Jack the next 48 hours would tell the story. Then he left, and Jack and Sarah were alone in the kitchen, and the house was very quiet. Jack sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup she'd put in front of him. He was looking at nothing. "This is how Margaret died," he said. The name came out of nowhere and landed in the room with weight. Sarah sat down across from him slowly. "Your wife," she said. "She was sick 4 days. Jack said. I didn't realize how bad until it was—" He stopped. He put the cup down and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment, watched him absorb it, the way he absorbed everything alone inward contained. She was 31, he said. I'm sorry, Sarah said. Eli doesn't remember her, Jack said. He was barely 2. Ben remembers, but not enough just pieces. A voice, a smell, the way she laughed. He was quiet for a moment. Sometimes Eli will say something that's exactly the way she would have said it, and I don't know if that's a comfort, or— He didn't finish the sentence. Or if it just makes it hurt in a new place, Sarah said quietly. He looked at her. Yes, he said. That. They sat together in the quiet kitchen, the lamp between them, and Sarah thought about Thomas, about grief, and its strange geography, the way it didn't diminish so much as it spread, became the landscape you lived inside. And she thought that here across this table was a man who lived in the same landscape, who had been living in it longer, and who had been doing it completely alone. You don't have to do it by yourself, she said, and she wasn't sure she meant to say it aloud. Jack looked at her. I've been doing it by myself for 3 years, he said. I know, she said. And it shows. Not in a bad way, in a you're holding everything together way. But you're holding it alone, and that's a hard thing. His expression was complicated, not closed, not open somewhere in between. Like a door that wasn't locked, but wasn't swinging free either. Sarah. He said her name again, that simple word with all its unexpected weight. Why are you still here? She looked at him. What do you mean? I mean this isn't what you signed up for. Sick children and bank threats and a man who doesn't know how to talk to people. The corner of his mouth moved. A wall according to my 8-year-old. Sarah almost laughed, despite herself. Your 8-year-old is unnervingly accurate. He is, Jack said. It's inconvenient. I'm here, Sarah said, because this is the first place in a long time where I felt like I was doing something that mattered. And because your boys are good boys. And because— She paused, choosing her words carefully. Because I think you're a better man than you let most people see. The silence between them changed quality. Not uncomfortable. Something else, something careful and new, like a thing that was deciding whether it was safe to exist. I don't know what to do with that, Jack said finally, and she appreciated that he was honest about it. You don't have to do anything with it, she said. I just wanted you to know. Eli's fever broke on Saturday afternoon. Sarah heard it before she saw it, the change in his breathing, the way he stopped fighting the blankets and went soft against the mattress. She came in to check and found his face cool, his color better, his eyes open and clearer than they'd been in 2 days. I'm hungry, he said. She put her hand over her mouth. Then she laughed, and the laugh had tears in it somewhere, and she didn't try to stop either. Good, she said. That's very, very good. She found Jack in the yard and told him. He stopped moving. Completely. For one moment he was absolutely still, and she saw the relief move through him like a wave from his feet to his face, and his eyes went bright in a way that had nothing to do with the sun. He didn't say anything. He just nodded once, and then he walked to the barn, and she understood he needed a moment that wasn't in front of anyone, and she let him have it. Ben came and stood beside her. He'll be all right, Ben said. Not about Eli, about his father. I know, Sarah said. Ben looked at her with those watchful, careful eyes. You're different from the others, he said. How so? She asked. The others left when things got hard, Ben said. He looked down at his boots for a moment. Things got hard about 3 days in. Sarah looked at the side of his face. How long have I been here? She asked. Ben looked up, and for the first time, the very first time, he smiled. Not a big smile, but real. 18 days, he said. 18 days and a sick child and a man with a failing ranch and a predator circling the water rights, and a ledger that told hard truths and a conversation at 4 a.m. about a woman named Margaret who had died at 31. 18 days, and she had not left. She thought about what Jack had asked her. Why are you still here? She hadn't said everything. She'd said the true things, but not all of them. She hadn't said that somewhere in the last 18 days, in the spaces between the work and the worry, something had taken root in her that she was afraid to look at directly. Something that had to do with a man who talked with his hands and his feet instead of his mouth, who loved his sons with a ferocity that he couldn't put into words, but that was present in every decision he made, who had sat across a kitchen table from her at 4 a.m. and said a dead woman's name for what she suspected was the first time in years. She hadn't said that. She wasn't going to say it yet. But she knew it was there. And standing in the yard watching Ben go back inside, feeling the afternoon sun on her face. Sarah Evans understood with the slow, certain clarity of something that cannot be undone, once it's known that she was in very real danger of doing something she had told herself she was nowhere near ready to do. She was in danger of falling in love with Jack Wheeler. She didn't act on it. That was the first thing she decided clearly, and without negotiation, the morning after Eli's fever broke. Whatever was growing in her, that quiet, inconvenient thing she'd finally named the day before, it was going to stay exactly where it was unnamed, to everyone but herself, locked down tight, while there were still too many other things at stake. Jack Wheeler had a ranch he was fighting to keep. He had 2 boys who had already lost one woman who mattered to them. And he had made himself perfectly clear on the front porch the day she arrived. I'm not looking for anything beyond what we agreed to. She had said she wasn't either. She intended to keep that promise even if keeping it was starting to cost her something. So she worked. She worked hard and deliberately, and with all the focus she could bring to bear, because work was honest and uncomplicated, and it left her too tired in the evenings to sit still long enough to feel things she wasn't supposed to feel. Eli recovered fast, the way young children do, as if the sickness had been a weather event rather than a crisis, something to be endured and then forgotten in favor of more important things, like whether Ash would tolerate wearing a piece of ribbon around her neck. The answer, it turned out, was definitively no. Eli bore 3 parallel scratches on his left forearm with enormous pride. Ben went back to his numbers and his watching. Jack went back to the fence lines and the ledger and the practiced silence that was his natural habitat. And if something had shifted between him and Sarah in the kitchen at 4 a.m, something in the quality of the air between them, something slightly warmer and slightly more dangerous than what had been there before neither of them named it or reached for it, and the house went on. But houses have their own memory, and the boys noticed everything. It was Ben who forced the first crack. 10 days after Eli's fever, Ben appeared in the kitchen doorway, while Sarah was washing up the dinner plates, and said with the directness that was his particular gift, "Are you going to stay?" Sarah kept her hands in the water. "I thought we talked about this." "We talked about whether you planned to leave," Ben said. "That's different. Plans change. I'm asking something different. I'm asking if you want to stay." She turned and looked at him. He was standing with his arms crossed in the way that meant he'd been thinking about this for a while and had decided to say it anyway. "Why are you asking?" she said. "Because Papa is different when you're here," Ben said. "And I want to know if it means anything or if it's just—" He stopped himself, pressed his mouth together the way Jack did when he was choosing words. "I don't want Eli to get attached to something that's going to leave." The words landed the way Ben's words always landed, precisely without softening, right where they were aimed. "Ben," Sarah said quietly, "I am not going anywhere." "You said that before. You said you didn't plan to." "I'm saying it differently now," she said. "I'm not going anywhere. Not because I have nowhere else to go that's changed. I have options now. Because I don't want to. Because this is because you and Eli and this house matter to me. Do you understand the difference?" Ben studied her for a long moment with those old, careful eyes. "Yes," he said. "Then, Papa matters to you too." It wasn't a question. Sarah looked at him steadily. "That," she said, "is a more complicated conversation." "I know," Ben said. He unfolded his arms. "I just wanted you to know that I wouldn't mind. If it was less complicated, I wouldn't mind." He turned to leave, and then stopped. "Eli would be insufferable about it. Just so you know." He'd probably try to name a second cat after you." He was gone before she could respond. Sarah stood at the sink with her hands still in the water, laughed so hard her eyes watered, and then pressed her wet hands against her face and took a long, slow breath. Désolé. Cole came back on a Wednesday, and this time, Jack was home. Sarah heard them from inside the low, careful voices of two men who were very angry and very controlled about it, which was worse than shouting. She didn't go to the door, but she stood close enough to the window to hear, because whatever was being said, she needed to know it. "My offer's final wheeler," Cole said. 50 cents on the dollar for the North Parcel water rights included. You sign this week, the banknote gets restructured on my say-so. You don't sign, I guarantee you won't make September." "You guarantee," Jack said. Flat, quiet. "I've got friends at the bank, Wheeler. You know that. I've got friends at the county recorder's office too, as it happens. Funny how paperwork can get lost. Titles, agreements, that kind of thing." A pause. "Get off my land," Jack said. "You're making a mistake." "I've made mistakes before," Jack said. "Get off my land, Cole. Don't come back." She heard the horse move, and then Cole's voice one last time, already retreating, carrying the particular ugliness of a man who has decided that politeness is no longer required. "I'll be back, Wheeler. You won't like what I bring with me." Then quiet. Jack came inside. He was holding himself very still, that controlled stillness that Sarah now understood was what his anger looked like when he was managing it hard. "He's going to move on the title," Sarah said. Jack looked at her. "The county recorder's office," she said. "He said paperwork gets lost. He's telling you what he plans to do. He's going to go after your deed." Jack's jaw worked. "I know." "The grazing agreement with the shared water clause, where's the original?" "In the desk." "Is there a copy anywhere? A lawyer's office, a courthouse, anywhere outside this property?" He hesitated. "No." "Then we need to make one," Sarah said. "Today. And we need to get it somewhere Cole can't reach." She was already moving toward the desk. "Who's the closest lawyer you trust? Not the county seat, somewhere else. Somewhere Cole doesn't have friends." "There's a man in Wichita Falls," Jack said slowly. "Harmon. He handled my father's estate. He's not cheap." "You have $42 coming from Carver Supply," Sarah said. "I'll write the letter to Carver today. You write to Harmon and tell him what Cole is doing. Send copies of the deed and the grazing agreement with the letter. Get it on tomorrow's post before Cole has time to move." Jack was looking at her with that expression she'd seen before, the one she still didn't have a name for, the one that lived somewhere between surprise and something else entirely. "You're very calm right now," he said. "One of us has to be," she said, not unkindly. He came and stood beside her at the desk, close enough that she could feel the tension in him, the held-back anger, the fear underneath it. She handed him a piece of paper and a pen, and their fingers touched briefly, just a second, and neither of them said anything about it. "Write to Harmon," she said. He wrote. The letters went out the next morning. Jack rode them to the post himself before sunup, and when he came back, he looked like a man who had done the one thing available to him, and was now waiting to find out if it was enough. Sarah understood that particular feeling in her bones. She'd lived inside it for weeks after Thomas died. What came next was a waiting game, and waiting games had a way of making everything else feel louder. Ben picked that week to ask her about his mother, not in the tentative sideways way he'd done before on the back steps directly across the dinner table after Jack had gone out to check the stock, with the specific courage of a boy who had decided he deserved a real answer. "What do you want to know?" Sarah asked. "What she was like," Ben said. "People don't talk about her. Papa doesn't. Decker doesn't. The pastor said she was a fine woman, which doesn't mean anything." "What do you remember?" Sarah said. Ben was quiet for a moment. "Her hands," he said. "They were always warm, and she smelled like the soap she made herself, something with mint in it." He paused. "She laughed a lot. I remember that. The house was louder when she was alive." Eli had gone very still across the table. He was listening in the focused, serious way he listened when something mattered to him. She sounds like she was wonderful, Sarah said. She was, Ben said. He looked at his plate. I don't want to forget her. You won't, Sarah said. The things you just told me, you've carried those for 6 years. They're yours. They're not going anywhere. Papa's forgetting, Ben said, and his voice had something fragile in it that wasn't usually there. I can tell. He doesn't talk about her because if he talks about her, he has to feel it, and he's been not feeling it for so long that I don't think he knows how anymore. Sarah looked at this 8-year-old boy who was too wise and too burdened and too alone with the things he understood, and she felt something fierce and protective move through her. Your father feels everything, she said. He just doesn't have the words for it yet. That's different from forgetting. Ben looked up. Do you think he'll ever get the words? Behind her, she heard the door. Jack had come back in quietly earlier than she expected, and she didn't know how much he'd heard. She didn't turn around. I think, she said carefully, that some people need someone who speaks their language before they can find the words. The kitchen was very quiet. Then Jack said from the doorway, his voice low and even, Boys, time for bed. He didn't say anything to her that night, but he didn't go immediately to the ledger either. He sat at the table after the boys were down, and Sarah moved around the kitchen doing the last of the cleanup, and the silence between them was different from his usual silence. His usual silence was a closed door. This was more like a door that was ajar, neither open nor shut, uncertain of itself. She was almost finished when he said, Margaret made her soap with mint. Sarah's hands went still. I could smell it for months, he said, after she was gone. It faded eventually. I was relieved when it faded, and then I was angry at myself for being relieved. He paused. Ben's right. I don't talk about her. You don't have to, Sarah said. Not tonight. Maybe not, he said. But maybe I've been not talking about her for the wrong reasons. He looked at his hands on the table. I told myself it was for the boys, that seeing me grieve would make it worse for them. But Ben... He stopped. He's been carrying it alone because I wouldn't carry it with him. Sarah turned and looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the table, at the grain of the wood, at something she couldn't see. Jack, she said, and his name in her mouth felt different than it used to, more real, more weighted. You didn't know. I should have, he said. People do what they can survive, she said. That's not the same as doing wrong. He looked up then, and the look on his face, the naked, unguarded, exhausted honesty of it, hit her somewhere behind the sternum and stayed there. I don't know how to do this differently, he said. I genuinely don't know. Yes, you do, Sarah said. You just did it. What you just said, that's different. That's the first different thing you've done in 3 years, I'd guess. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face slowly, like ice at the edge of a thaw. Not gone, not resolved, but moving. You're very sure of things, he said, and it wasn't a criticism. It was something else. I'm sure of the things I'm sure of, she said. I'm uncertain about a great deal. Like what? She held his gaze. Like what happens to this household if Cole wins and the bank calls your note in September? It was a deflection, and she knew it, and from the way something shifted slightly in his expression, she thought he might know it too. But he accepted it. He nodded once and looked back at the table. Harmon will write back by the end of the month, he said. We'll know more then. Yes, she said. We will. She went to bed. She lay in the dark listening to Clara breathe and told herself she had handled that well. She had not said the wrong thing. She had not stepped across a line she'd promised herself she wouldn't cross. She had kept it practical and safe. She was lying to herself, and she knew it. What she had felt standing at the kitchen table with Jack Wheeler looking at her like that was not practical and was not safe and was not going anywhere just because she'd managed not to say it out loud. The letter from Harmon arrived 23 days after they sent it on a morning when the heat was ferocious, and the boys were restless, and Jack had been short-tempered since sunup. Sarah saw him take it from the post rider and watched his face while he read it in the yard, and she knew from the way he went still that it was significant. She waited. She gave him 10 minutes, and then she went out. "What does he say?" she asked. Jack held her. She read it standing next to him in the heat. Harmon said the grazing agreement's water clause was valid and defensible under Texas land law. He said the deed, if properly recorded, could not be nullified without a court proceeding that would take at minimum 18 months and would require evidence of fraud that Cole could not easily manufacture. He said the immediate priority was to file a certified copy of the deed with the state land office in Austin, bypassing the county recorder entirely, which would remove Cole's local leverage completely. The filing fee was $12. He would handle the paperwork for an additional $37. Against $37 stood the most sophisticated predatory land acquisition scheme Sarah had seen, and she had seen one up close. $37 stood between Jack Wheeler and losing everything. "The Carver credit," she said immediately. "That's 42, Jack said. "If they pay it." "They'll pay it. I wrote a letter that didn't give them a choice." She looked up at him. "Send Harmon the 37 and keep 5 in reserve. You have enough." Jack took the letter back carefully and held it for a moment. "If this works," he said slowly, "Cole's got nothing. No county leverage, no deed manipulation. He's left with the banknote, and if I can get to September with the cattle sale—" "How much will the cattle bring?" Sarah asked. "Enough," he said. "If the market holds. Enough to cover the note and have something left." "Then this is the path," Sarah said. He looked at her. The morning sun was full on his face, and she could see in it the same thing she'd been seeing for weeks now, that slow, reluctant thaw, something long frozen coming incrementally loose. It was not comfortable, it was not quick, but it was real. "Sarah," he said. Her stomach tightened. The way he said her name had been doing things to her for weeks, and she'd been ignoring it, and she intended to keep ignoring it. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. He looked at the letter in his hands, then he looked at her. And the question that came out of his mouth was not the one she was braced for. "Would you be willing to write to Harmon yourself?" he said. I don't write well. You've seen my letters. Harmon needs someone who can be precise. If you wrote the correspondence, explained the timeline, the pressure from Cole." He stopped. "You're better at it than I am. I'd ask if you were willing." She looked at him for a moment, and the thing she felt was enormous and complicated, and she pressed all of it down hard. "Of course," she said. "I'll write it today." "Thank you," he said. "Jack," she said before she could stop herself. He looked at her. She made herself stay steady, made herself say the one true and safe thing instead of the 10 true and unsafe things stacked up behind it. "You're going to keep this ranch." Something crossed his face, something that was gratitude, and more than gratitude, and less than what it wanted to be. "I know," he said, and his voice was rough. "I know that now." He went back inside. Sarah stood in the heat and pressed her hands together and told herself firmly that she was fine. She was not fine, but she was managing. And out here in a life built in broken places, managing was enough. For now, managing was enough. What she didn't know, what she had absolutely no way of knowing, standing in that yard with the sun on her face and Hope moving cautiously back into the house, was that Harlan Cole was not finished. He had one more play left, and it was not about the land or the water or the bank. It was about her, and it was going to change everything before it was over. Cole's play came on a Friday, and it didn't come from Cole directly. That was the first thing that told Sarah how serious it was. Men like Harlan Cole didn't do their dirty work themselves when they could find someone cheaper to do it for them. The woman's name was Dora Finch. She arrived in town, not at the ranch, at the town on the Friday morning stage, and by Friday afternoon she had visited the pastor's wife, the postmistress, and the woman who ran the dry goods counter, which meant that by Friday evening everything she had said was moving through Clearwater, the way fire moves through dry grass. Fast and in every direction at once. Sarah heard it from Decker Jack's ranch hand, who was a taciturn man of few words, and had clearly rehearsed what he was going to say several times on the ride back from town, because he still couldn't look at her when he said it. There's talk, he said, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands. About you. Coming from a woman who says she knew your husband. In Abilene. Sarah went very still. What kind of talk? Decker's jaw worked. She's saying your husband's debts weren't that they weren't regular business debts. She's saying Thomas Evans owed money to men he shouldn't have been dealing with. And she's saying... He stopped, tried again. She's saying you knew about it. That you were part of it. The world didn't spin. Sarah had been through enough now that the world didn't spin when bad things happened. It just went very clear and very cold, like water dropped to just above freezing. And what else? She said, because there was always an and else. Decker looked at his hat. She's saying, the baby isn't your husband's. Sarah heard herself breathe out slow and controlled. Who sent her? She asked. Decker looked up. I don't know for certain. But you suspect. He held her gaze for a moment. Cole was in town Tuesday. First time in a month. Sarah nodded. She thanked Decker, who looked relieved to have it over with, and she went inside and stood in the kitchen for a long moment, with her hands flat on the work table, letting herself feel the full shape of it. Thomas's name. Clara's name. Her own name dragged through a stranger's mouth in a town that was just beginning to accept her. This was not a land play. This was personal. Cole had decided that if he couldn't take the ranch, he would take the thing that was holding the ranch together. He had decided to take her. She told Jack that evening after the boys were in bed. She sat across the table from him, and she told him all of it. Decker's face Dora Finch every word of what was being said. She told it flat and clear, and without crying, because crying would have to come later if it came at all. And right now, she needed him to hear the information, not manage her feelings about it. Jack listened without interrupting. His face went through several things, none of them small. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is any of it true?" She looked at him. "No," she said. Thomas's debts were business debts, bad investments, and bad luck, not criminal dealings. I didn't know how deep they were, but they were legitimate, and Clara is Thomas's daughter. I want you to know I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm telling you because I won't have you hear it secondhand without hearing it from me first. Jack held her gaze. I'm not asking because I doubt you, he said. I'm asking because I need to know exactly what we're working against. Something in her chest eased just slightly. Then that's what we're working against. Lies. Specifically chosen to make me someone this town won't want in a decent home. Cole's trying to get you fired, Jack said. Cole's trying to get me gone, Sarah said. If I'm gone, you're back to managing this alone. And a man managing a failing ranch alone with 2 children and no help is a man who makes desperate decisions. Jack's eyes hardened. He thinks I'll sell if you leave. I think he's betting on it, Sarah said. The silence between them was charged now, not the uncertain, careful silence of the past weeks, but something sharper, something with direction. You're not leaving, Jack said. It came out different from how she expected, not as a question, not even quite as a statement, more like a declaration, something decided. I'm not planning to, she said carefully. But Jack the town. If the talk gets bad enough, if people decide, I don't care what people decide, he said. You will when it affects the boys, she said. When Ben goes to school and hears what children repeat from their parents. When the pastor's wife stops speaking to me at the post office. You will care then, because they will care and you care about them more than anything. His jaw was tight. So what do? We answer it, Sarah said. Not by hiding and hoping it dies down. We answer it directly. How? She had been thinking about this since Decker told her. She had the shape of an answer, but saying it out loud was going to change something between them, and she knew it, and she said it anyway. I need to go into town, she said. I need to speak to the pastor, and I need you to come with me. Not to defend me, I can speak for myself. But to be there, together. Because right now, the story being told is that I'm a woman of questionable character who inserted herself into a decent man's household. The only way to answer that story is to show people a different one. Jack was looking at her with an expression she had no precedent for on his face. She pushed on. "I know what I'm suggesting," she said. "I know, and I want you to know that I am not asking for anything beyond what this situation requires. I'm asking you to stand beside me in public one time so that this town sees that you trust me. That's all." "That's not all," Jack said quietly. "And you know it." The kitchen was very, very quiet. "Jack," she started. "Sarah." His voice stopped her. "I'm going to say something and I need you to let me finish it before you respond. Can you do that?" She nodded. He looked at the table for a moment and then at her. "When Margaret died, I told myself I was done with this, with wanting something for myself that wasn't the ranch or the boys. I told myself it was because I was practical, because I'd done the math on what loving someone costs when you lose them, and the math didn't work." He paused. "That was a lie I told myself because the truth was too hard. The truth was I was afraid. And I've been afraid for 3 years, and it's made me smaller. Ben could see it. A 5-year-old could see it. And I—" He stopped, tried again. "I have not been fair to you. I've been taking what you give this house and these boys and telling myself it's a transaction, telling myself I feel nothing because feeling something was terrifying. And that wasn't fair. You deserve better than that." Sarah sat very still. "I'm not asking you to feel anything you don't feel," he said. "I'm not saying any of this to— I'm not trying to make this complicated when you've asked me specifically not to. But I can't sit here while a man like Cole drags your name through the dirt and pretend the reason I'm angry is practical. The reason I'm angry is because it's you. And I needed to say that out loud at least once." The lamp between them flickered. Outside, the Texas wind moved through the dark. Sarah looked at this man, this guarded, difficult, slowly thawing man, and she understood with the particular clarity of someone who has been bracing for something so long she'd forgotten she was bracing that the thing she'd been afraid of had already happened. She was not in danger of falling in love with Jack Wheeler. She had already fallen. She just hadn't said it. "You're not making it complicated," she said, and her voice was quieter than she intended. "You're making it true." Jack looked at her. "I feel it too," she said. "I've felt it for a long time. I didn't say it because you'd told me not to want anything beyond the agreement, and because I thought—" She pressed her lips together. "I thought if I said it you'd send me away, and the boys needed me here, and I needed to be here, and I wasn't willing to risk that." "I'm not sending you away," Jack said. "I know that now." They sat with it for a moment. The thing finally said, the room slightly changed around it. Then Jack said, "I'll come to town with you tomorrow." "All right," she said. "And Sarah?" He looked at her steadily, all the way, steadily, with none of his usual careful distance. "After this is done, the ranch coal, all of it, I'd like to talk about something more permanent. If you'd want that." Sarah breathed. "Yes," she said. "I'd want that." They went to town the next morning, the 4 of them, Jack and Sarah, and both boys Clara on Sarah's hip. It was deliberate. It was visible. Jack walked beside her through the main street with the specific, unhurried straightforwardness of a man who had nothing to apologize for, and the specific deliberateness of a man who was making a point without raising his voice. People noticed. Of course they noticed. The pastor's wife noticed from the dry goods store doorway. The postmistress noticed from behind her window. 3 men outside the feed store noticed, watched, and nudged each other. Eli noticed none of this and was engaged in an ongoing argument with Ben about whether the horse tied outside the barber shop was brown or dark red, which Ben said were different things and Eli said were not. The pastor received them in his office. He was a careful man, gray-haired and deliberate, and he heard Sarah out completely before he spoke. She told him the facts. She told him Thomas's debts were matters of public record available in the Abilene County Courthouse, and that any man willing to send for them would find nothing criminal in them. She told him Clara's parentage was a matter that she would not justify with proof beyond her own word, because there was no proof she could provide that a determined liar couldn't dispute, and she expected to be believed or not believed on the basis of her character as he had observed it. And she told him that Dora Finch had arrived in Clearwater 3 days after Harlan Cole's last visit to the Wheeler Ranch, and that she would leave the pastor to draw his own conclusions about that coincidence. The pastor looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Jack. "Mrs. Evans has been in your household for nearly 2 months," he said. "In your honest assessment." "She's the best thing to happen to my family since my wife died," Jack said. "And I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean, Reverend. You know that." The pastor nodded slowly. "I'll speak to the congregation Sunday," he said. "I'm not asking for a sermon on my behalf," Sarah said. "No," the pastor said with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "But I am asking myself where a woman of disreputable character would have learned to write the kind of letter she apparently wrote to Carver Supply, because Earl Carver mentioned at the county meeting last week that he'd received a piece of correspondence from the Wheeler Ranch that was, in his words, the most diplomatically devastating thing he'd read since his wife's mother wrote to him before their wedding." He paused. He meant it as a compliment. He sent the $42 by return post. Sarah blinked. Beside her, she heard Jack make a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. "Mrs. Evans," the pastor said, standing, "I cannot silence every tongue in this county, but I can make clear what this congregation will and will not entertain. I'll take care of what I can take care of. You take care of the rest." Dora Finch was still in town. Sarah found her at the boarding house, having inquired with the precision of a woman who knows exactly how much time she has before her courage runs out. Jack started to come with her. She put her hand on his arm the first time she had touched him with intention, and she felt him go very still beneath it. "Wait here," she said. "This part is mine." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. She went up the boarding house steps alone. Dora Finch was a woman in her mid-40s with the look of someone who had been talked into things before and knew it, and had decided that this time she was going to get paid enough to make it worth the guilt. She opened the door and saw Sarah, and her face went through several things in rapid succession. "How much?" Sarah asked before the woman could speak. Dora Finch blinked. "I beg your—" "How much did Cole pay you to come here?" Sarah said. "I'm not angry with you. I want to know what my reputation was worth to him." A long pause. Dora Finch's chin came up. $20, she said, and the number had shame in it. $20, Sarah said. She let that sit for a moment. "Did he tell you it was true? What you were supposed to say?" Another pause. He said there was reason to believe. "He told you enough to make you feel it wasn't quite lying," Sarah said. "I know that feeling. I know what it's like when someone constructs a story around you and makes it just plausible enough to repeat." She looked at the woman steadily. "I am Thomas Evans's widow. My daughter is his child. His debts were business debts and nothing more. If you have any doubt about that, the Abilene courthouse will show you what you need to see." She paused. "I'm asking you to stop saying what you've been saying. Not for my sake, I'll survive what's been said, but because you have to live with it too, and $20 is not enough to buy a clean conscience. I know that from experience." Dora Finch looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes, not simple, not easy, but real. "I didn't know he was lying," she said, "and it came out small. I told myself it might be true." "I know," Sarah said. "I'm sorry," Dora Finch said, and she meant it. Sarah could hear it rough and genuine the way apologies sound when they're not practiced. "Thank you," Sarah said. She turned and went back down the steps. Jack was waiting at the bottom. He looked at her face and seemed to understand at least in part what had happened. "All right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He offered her his arm. She took it, and they walked back through the main street to where Ben and Eli were waiting with the horses. Eli still maintaining his position on the horse's collar with the passionate certainty of someone who has never been wrong in his life. Ben looked at them. He looked specifically at the way his father's arm was linked with Sarah's, and at the way neither of them appeared to find it remarkable. He said nothing, smiled the same rare, real smile she'd seen 18 days in when he told her she was different from the others. Slightly wider this time. Just slightly. The reply from Harmon came 4 days later. The state land office filing had been accepted. The certified copy of the deed was now in Austin beyond the reach of any county recorder Cole had in his pocket. The water clause of the grazing agreement had been formally noted in the filing. Harmon wrote that in his professional opinion, Cole's legal leverage was effectively eliminated, and that any further harassment would itself become actionable. Jack read the letter twice. Then he set it on the table, and he looked at Sarah, and he said, "It's done." "It's done," she said. Eli appeared in the doorway with Ash in his arms. "What's done?" he asked. "The ranch is safe," Jack said. Eli considered this. "Was it not safe before?" "Not entirely," Jack said. "Oh." Eli looked at Sarah. "Did you help?" "We all helped," Sarah said. Eli nodded with great satisfaction. "Good," he said. "Because if we had to leave, I was going to have to find somewhere Ash could come too, and that was going to be complicated." He went back to whatever he'd been doing, utterly unbothered, trailing the cat behind him. Jack looked at Sarah. The look lasted a moment longer than practical. "I meant what I said the other night," he said, "about something more permanent." "I know," she said. "I don't have a lot to offer right now," he said. "The ranch is safe, but it's not rich. The boys they're a great deal." "I know what the boys are," Sarah said. "I helped name one of their cats." Something in Jack's face shifted that slow, incomplete thaw, going one step further. "I want to ask you properly," he said. "Not like this, not standing in the kitchen. I want to do it right. Give me a little time." Sarah looked at him. This man. This careful, honest, slowly opening man. "You have time," she said. He nodded. He started to turn away, then stopped. He turned back, stepped toward her and took her hand. Just her hand firmly, briefly, the way a man holds something he intends to keep, and then released it and went outside. Sarah stood in the kitchen with her hand warm where he'd held it, and Clara pulling at her skirt. And somewhere outside, Eli singing his tuneless song to his cat, and the late afternoon light coming through the window, and the feeling inside her chest was something she hadn't felt since before Thomas died. Something she'd begun to think she might not feel again. It felt like home, not a place of feeling. The feeling of being exactly where you were supposed to be, with exactly the people you were supposed to be with. She had come to this ranch with 11 cents and broken shoes and a daughter on her back and nothing left to lose. She had not expected to find anything here except survival. What she had found was something she didn't have a word for yet, something larger and more complicated and more solid than she'd known how to imagine when she was walking those last 14 miles on a borrowed road. Something that had taken root in broken ground and grown anyway the way strong things do. The way love does when it decides it's going to happen regardless of the conditions. She picked Clara up, settled her on her hip, and started dinner. Outside, Jack was talking to his boys in the yard. She couldn't hear the words, just the low sound of his voice, and then Ben's voice, and then Eli's voice going higher with whatever he was insisting on, and then Jack's voice again. And then cutting through all of it, unmistakable and clear in the evening air, something she had heard only rarely, and had never once taken for granted. Jack Wheeler was laughing. Sarah closed her eyes for a second and held on to that sound. Then she went back to the stove, and she smiled, and she let herself believe fully, without reservation, for the first time in a very long time, that the worst was behind them. She didn't know yet how wrong she was. She was wrong in a way she hadn't anticipated, which was the worst kind of wrong. It wasn't Cole. Cola had gone quiet since the Austin filing, the way men like him go quiet when they've been outmaneuvered, not gone, just recalculating, waiting for a new angle that hadn't presented itself yet. It wasn't the bank which had extended the note without fanfare once Harmon made clear that the collateral was cleaner than originally represented. It wasn't the town which had largely settled back into its own business after the pastor said his quiet, measured piece on Sunday, and Dora Finch left on the Tuesday stage without saying goodbye to anyone. What she was wrong about was simpler and harder than any of that. She was wrong about herself. She had told herself she was steady. She had told herself the worst was behind them, that the danger had passed, that she could begin cautiously without rushing to let herself believe in what was being built in the Wheeler house. And in believing that she had let her guard down. She had stopped watching herself so carefully. She had started to feel safe. And feeling safe, it turned out, was exactly when the things you'd been outrunning caught up to you. It was Ben who found the letter. He wasn't snooping, that wasn't Ben's way. He had gone to the post office himself on an errand, and the postmistress, who had apparently decided that the events of the previous weeks constituted enough of a relationship with the Wheeler household to take liberties, had handed Ben a letter addressed to Sarah Evans without waiting for Sarah to come collect it herself. Ben brought it home and gave it to her at the kitchen table, and something in the handwriting on the envelope, the particular precise loops of it, made Sarah's hands go cold before she even opened it. She knew that handwriting. She had not seen it in over 2 years, but she knew it the way you know the handwriting of someone who once had power over you. The letter was from Gerald Marsh, Thomas's older brother, the man who had controlled the family money before Thomas struck out on his own, and who had never forgiven Thomas for it, and who had never looked at Sarah as anything other than the woman who had taken his brother's attention and his brother's loyalty, and given nothing back in return that Gerald could quantify. She read it, standing at the table. Ben watched her face with his scientist's eyes and said nothing. Gerald Marsh had heard of Thomas's death. Gerald Marsh was writing to inform her, in the precise language of a man who had prepared this letter with legal counsel, that Thomas had borrowed $200 from him 7 years prior during the first year of their marriage, and that this debt with interest now stood at $312, and that as Thomas's widow Sarah was the responsible party, and that Gerald would be pursuing repayment through whatever legal means were available to him. $312. Sarah set the letter down. "Bad news?" Ben asked. She looked at him, this careful, watchful boy who was not she, had long since understood a child in any way that made it appropriate to shelter him from the truth. "I owe money," she said, "that I didn't know I owed." Ben looked at the letter. "To who?" "My husband's brother." "Is it real, the debt?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "It might be. Thomas borrowed money in the early years, he told me that much. He never told me from whom." She pressed her hands flat on the table. $312. Ben said nothing for a moment. Then, "Are you going to leave?" The question hit her like cold water. She looked at him sharply. "No," she said. "Because if you need to go, deal with it, if you need to go somewhere." "Ben." She waited until he was looking at her. "I am not leaving. Do you understand me? I said I wasn't going anywhere, and I meant it. This is a problem to be solved, not a reason to go. Do you hear the difference?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, and then smaller. "I just every time something's good, something else." "I know," she said. "I know, me too." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, briefly but firmly. "We solved the problem, that's all." Ben looked down at her hand, and then back up, and nodded. She waited until after dinner to tell Jack. She waited because she needed the time to be calm about it, and because she did not want to have this conversation with fear driving it. She wanted to have it clearly as two people who were building something together, not as a woman reporting a disaster to a man who was responsible for fixing it. She put the letter on the table in front of him. He read it. His face went through the same tightening she'd seen before, and then something else. A focused, cold anger that was different from the fear anger she'd seen with Cole. This was cleaner, more directed. "He waited until Thomas was dead," Jack said. "Yes." "And you didn't know about this loan?" "I knew Thomas borrowed money in the early years. I didn't know the amount or the source. Gerald was he, and Thomas weren't close by the time we married. I didn't know they were doing business." Is it legitimate? It might be, she said. I can't say it isn't without seeing the original agreement, and I don't have it. Gerald may have it, or he may have nothing, and he's counting on me not having the money to fight it. Jack looked at the letter again. $312, he said. I know what it is, she said. Asking you for it. I want to be clear about that. He looked up. I didn't think you were. I'm telling you because you need to know. And because... She paused. Because I don't want things between us to be built on things I haven't told you. There can't be secrets in what we're building. I've had that. I know what it does. Jack looked at her steadily. What do you need? I need Harmon's advice, she said. I need to know whether Gerald has a legal claim and if he does, what my options are. And I need... She stopped, breathed. I need you to know that I'm not a liability. I know how this looks. A woman who came with nothing and keeps arriving with new problems. I know that's not a comfortable thing to be taking on. Sarah. His voice was quiet and flat and left no room for argument. Stop. She looked at him. You've been in this house for 9 weeks, he said. In 9 weeks, you found me $42. I didn't know I had. You found a legal clause that saved this ranch. You sat up 3 nights with my sick child. You faced down a man's hired liar in a boarding house, and you wrote a letter that the Carver Supply Company apparently still talks about. He put the letter down. You are not a liability. You're the reason this house is still standing. Don't say that again. She hadn't cried, not properly, not in front of anyone since the first night she arrived. She felt the edge of it now and pressed it back. All right, she said. I'll write to Harmon tonight, he said. All right, she said again, quieter. He looked at her face. Come here, he said, and it was not a command. It was the kind of words that leave the decision entirely with the other person, that say, I want this, but I won't take it. She stood up and walked around the table, and Jack Wheeler put his arms around her the first time, the very first time, and she let herself lean into it just for a moment, just enough to feel the full, solid reality of it, and she breathed. We solved the problem, he said quietly above her head. That's all. She almost laughed. That's what I told Ben. Smart woman, he said. She pulled back before she wanted to, because there was more to get through first, and she knew it. But she held on to the feeling, the warmth of it, the realness, and carried it back to her side of the table like something necessary. Harmon's reply came in 9 days. It was the fastest turnaround yet, which told Sarah the man had understood the urgency in the way she'd written the letter. Gerald Marsh's claim Harmon wrote was legally thin. A verbal loan agreement from 7 years prior with no witness documentation and no signed instrument was difficult to prosecute under Texas law, particularly against a widow who had not been party to the original arrangement. More to the point, Harmon had taken the liberty of inquiring with the county records in the Marsh family's home territory and had discovered that Gerald Marsh himself was currently in arrears on a land tax and facing 2 separate civil claims from business partners of his own. A man in that position, Harmon wrote dryly, was unlikely to invest in expensive litigation against a woman in another county, particularly when that litigation would require him to produce documentation he almost certainly did not have. Harmon's recommendation was a single letter from Sarah Firm, brief, legally worded, acknowledging that she had received Gerald's correspondence, that she disputed the validity of the claimed debt, in the absence of written documentation, and that any further contact should be directed to her legal representative in Wichita Falls. His fee for drafting this letter, Harmon noted, would be $3, which he was willing to deduct from the balance owed. Sarah read this aloud at the dinner table, all 4 of them present, because Jack had started doing that, bringing things to the table instead of carrying them alone. A change so gradual she hadn't noticed it becoming a habit until it already was. When she finished, Eli said, "What's arrears?" "Behind on payments," Ben said. "So the bad man owes money too?" "Apparently," Jack said. Eli thought about this with great seriousness. "That's very ironic," he said. Jack looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Jack, Something passed between them that was warm and quiet, and entirely domestic in the best possible sense of the word. "Where did you learn ironic?" Ben asked his brother. "Mrs. Evans," Eli said, as if this were obvious. The letter to Gerald Marsh went out the following week. There was no reply. There never was one Gerald Marsh. It later emerged through Harmon's quiet inquiries, had settled his own legal problems by liquidating property, and had apparently concluded that pursuing a widow in Texas with a Wichita Falls lawyer was not the best use of his diminished resources. Sarah received nothing further from him, not an acknowledgement, not a withdrawal, just silence, which was its own kind of answer, and the best kind she could have hoped for. The September cattle sale came on a Thursday, and Jack rode out before dawn and came back in the late afternoon with the lines of his face looser than she had ever seen them. He came into the kitchen, and he looked at her, and he said, "It's enough. The note's covered, and there's $114 left." Sarah put down what she was doing. "Jack?" $114, he said again, as if he needed to hear it twice. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She put coffee in front of him, and she sat across from him, and they looked at each other in the quiet kitchen, with the particular silence of two people who have been through a very great deal and have come out the other side, and are not entirely sure yet what the other side looks like. "It's over," he said. "Not over," she said. "Different. A different chapter." He looked at her. "I want to ask you something." Her heart did the thing it had been doing for weeks whenever he looked at her that way. "All right," she said. Jack reached into his shirt pocket. He set something on the table between them, small plain. A thin band of gold, worn smooth, in the way of something that had been held many times. "This was my mother's," he said. "My father gave it to her in 1851. She wore it until she died." He looked at it for a moment. "I've been carrying it for a week, trying to find the right time." Sarah looked at the ring, then at him. "I'm not a man who is easy to live with," Jack said. "You know that better than anyone. I don't have words most of the time. I shut down when I should open up. I let fear run things longer than I should. I've been a wall according to my 8-year-old. The corner of his mouth moved. "But I love you. I've loved you for a long time, and I've been a coward about it, and I'm done being a coward. I want you to stay, not as what you are now as my wife, as the mother of my boys if you'll have them, as a someone I get to wake up next to and talk to and disagree with and learn from for the rest of my life." He paused. "I'm asking if you'll marry me, Sarah, because this house isn't a house anymore without you in it. And I'm not the man I was 2 months ago, and that's because of you. And I don't want to go back to being that man. Not ever." The kitchen was absolutely still. Sarah looked at this man, this honest, guarded, slowly rebuilt man, who had just handed her the most undecorated, most genuine proposal she had ever heard in her life, and she felt something in her chest go completely and irreversibly open. "Yes," she said. It came out without hesitation, without performance, without anything but the truth of it. "Yes, Jack, yes." He picked up the ring and reached across the table and slid it onto her finger, and his hands were steady in a way that told her he had been terrified and had decided to do it anyway, which was the bravest thing she'd ever seen him do. Then Ben appeared in the doorway. He looked at his father's hand over Sarah's. He looked at the ring. He looked at his father's face, and then at Sarah's face, and then he said with the absolute precision of a boy who had been waiting for this conclusion for longer than either of them knew, "It's about time." Jack made a sound that was unambiguously a laugh. Sarah pressed her free hand over her mouth. "Eli's going to name another cat after you," Ben said to Sarah. "I know," she said through the laugh. "We said you'd be insufferable about it," Jack told his son. "I'm not being insufferable," Ben said with great dignity. "I'm being accurate." He looked at Sarah one more time, that rare, real smile wider than she'd ever seen it. "I'm glad you didn't leave," he said, and then he was gone back down the hallway, leaving the two of them in the kitchen with the evening light and the ring on her finger and the sound of Eli somewhere in the house, probably explaining something important to his cat. They were married 6 weeks later on a Saturday in the small church in Clearwater. The pastor officiated, and Decker stood for Jack and the pastor's wife, who had come around in the particular way that small-town women come around when they've decided they were wrong about something completely, and without fanfare, brought a cake. Ben sat in the front pew with Clara on his lap, keeping her occupied with solemn efficiency. Eli sat beside them, and cried for reasons he could not fully articulate when asked later, except to say that it was very good crying, and he didn't want anyone to worry about it. Jack did not have many words at the altar. He did not need them. He held her hand, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for weeks fully, without the careful distance, without the managed stillness. And when the pastor asked if he took this woman, he said, "I do," in a voice that left absolutely no question about what he meant. Sarah had words. She had always had words. But standing there in the small church, with the ring already warm on her finger and Jack's hand over hers, she understood that some things were larger than the words available for them, and that was all right. Some things didn't need to be said. They just needed to be lived. "I do," she said, and meant everything in it. That winter was the coldest in 3 years, and the Wheeler Ranch felt none of it. Not because the cold wasn't real. It was fiercely, and Jack and Decker were out in it daily, keeping the stock alive and the water running and the fences intact. But the house was warm in a way it hadn't been in years, and everyone in it knew the difference. Eli had named the second cat Sadie, which he claimed was close enough, and Sadie and Ash formed an alliance of mutual tolerance that Ben documented in a small notebook he kept for reasons he declined to explain. Clara took her first steps in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning and grabbed Jack's finger to steady herself, and Jack looked at that small hand on his finger with an expression that Sarah committed to memory and kept there. Ben, who was 9 now, and no longer pretending to be 40, asked her one evening if she would teach him to write the way she wrote, the way that made Earl Carver send $42 and Gerald Marsh go permanently silent. "It's not a trick," she told him. "It's just knowing what you want to say, and saying it without apology." "You make it sound simple," Ben said. "It's not simple," she said, "but it's learnable. We'll start tomorrow." He was at the table before she was. The next morning, notebook open, waiting. She had come to this ranch with nothing but a child on her back and the refusal to beg. She had come looking for shelter, for safety, for ground solid enough to stand on. She had not come looking for love. She had not believed she was in a condition to find it, or in a place prepared to offer it. But love, she had learned, was not particularly interested in your conditions. Love looked at the broken places and decided to grow in them anyway. Love sat across a kitchen table at 4 in the morning and said a dead woman's name for the first time in years. Love named a cat with a grieving 5-year-old. Love found a legal clause in a 3-year-old grazing agreement and stood in a boarding house doorway and said, "I'm not angry with you," to a woman who had tried to destroy her because destroying people was never the point. The point was always what you built. The point was always forward. Jack Wheeler came in from the cold that evening, stamping his boots at the door, and looked across the kitchen at his wife. His wife. A thing still new enough to feel extraordinary every time he thought it. And the look on his face was the same look Eli had at 4 in the morning with his fever broken, and Ben had on the back steps when someone finally sat down beside him, and Clara had when Jack's hand was the thing that kept her from falling. It was the look of someone who was home. Sarah looked back at him from across the kitchen with their daughter on her hip and his son at the table, and the smell of bread in the air, and the ring on her finger, warm and familiar and entirely right. And she understood completely, without reservation, with every mile of the hard road that had led here accounted for, and accepted that this was not the life she had planned, and it was not the life she had lost, and it was not something she had been given. It was something she had built with her own hands out of broken pieces and honest work, and the refusal to stop. And it was without question, without exception, and without end, exactly enough.